How do you want to be remembered? Reflect on that question for just a moment. How do you want to be remembered? Imagine that you've passed away and you're able to be a heavenly spectator at your own funeral. What would your pastor, the person leading your service, say about your life? What would people from your places of worship, work, your neighborhood, your neighbors say about you? What would your family and friends say? What would you want them to say? He told us he was sick? When your life is all said and done, I believe that many of us in here want to be remembered as a person who loved others. I don't think one of us would want to wish that we'd spent more time at work, that we had bought a bigger house, that we had made more money, that we had been able to play more golf or purchase nicer clothes. I would hope that each of us would want to say and have others say about us that we love people with God's love. Our verses tonight, I believe, is a practical how-to guide on God-like love. A how-to guide on God-like love. Because in this passage, Paul demonstrates that love is an action. It's not an emotion. And consequently, because of that, you and I can love those who are unlovely and those who are unlovable. We can love our enemies, our persecutors. And I think Paul's thesis tonight is that love without action is not love. I saw an elderly couple a couple years ago sitting down to lunch at McDonald's. I noticed they had ordered one meal and one drink cup. And as I watched, the elderly gentleman carefully divided the hamburger in half with a plastic knife. One for him and one for her. Until each of them had half. And then he poured half of the soft drink that he had into that extra cup and he set it in front of his wife. The old gentleman began to eat and his wife sat there watching him with her hands folded in her lap. And I got up and I went over and I said, "Hey, I'd like to buy another meal if you would let me." And Scott Pitcher said, "Oh no. We've been married for 50 years and everything is always and will always be shared 50-50. I turned and I looked at Scott's wife and I asked if she was going to eat. And she simply looked at me and said, "Paul, it's Scott's turn with the teeth." To me, that demonstrates love, is it not? Sacrificial love. And in fact, our first division tonight is Division 1, display sacrificial love in verses 9 through 16. In verse 9, love must be without hypocrisy. Sometimes, some verses, some translations say that love must be sincere. And if you know anything about Greek, if you're studying it like the professor and I, and you know anything about Greek, you know you always go back and look at opening words. Because in this sense, they're not linked to anything before. Did you notice that, Professor? They're not linked to anything in the previous context. Paul literally says here, love sincerely, love without hypocrisy, or sincere love. We're to love others with an honest love, men, that knows no pretense. It's to be genuine, the same as Jesus did. You know, there have been some people in the Bible who have been pretty decent fakers, haven't there? One of the most well-known was who? A fellow by the name of Judas. The ultimate fake love was in the garden when Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss. Our English word sincerity comes from two Latin words, without, sin, and wax, cera. The word here was used to describe clay pots that were often broken, and if a clay pot developed a crack while it was in the pot shop, we're not talking about Colorado, but in a pot shop, the merchant would try to cover up the crack with a paste made out of wax. And it would be hard to tell, correct, Professor, if the pot was cracked or not. But if you took the pot home and you started cooking in it, the heat would melt the wax and you'd find out about the crack. And the merchant at the pot shop where they sold pots would be asked, is the pot sincere? Does it have wax? Or is it phony? You see, man, God wants our love to be sincere. He wants us to, it doesn't want us, He didn't ask us for it to be fake. He wants it to be genuine. So how can you find or live out true love? In the second verse, or part of verse 9, Paul defines true love with two principles that function like commands, doesn't he? Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Most of the earlier translations say abhor what is evil. Apostugo. Close, right? Okay. And it's only used here in the New Testament. This one word, abhor. It means to have a vehement dislike for something. It means to hate strongly. You see, true love does not tolerate evil. In the same breath, what does Paul say? He says that we are to cling to what is good. In extra-biblical Greek, and the professor and I will be glad to stand up here and tell you about biblical Greek and extra-biblical Greek, but in extra-biblical Greek, the word means to glue. Paul wants us to ultimately be glued to that which is good. And I challenge you to spend some time this week meditating. Ask yourself, do I really hate what is evil? Am I enraged over pride and selfishness, revenge, and other ungodly behaviors? Then ask yourself, on the flip side, do I really cling to what is good? Do I align myself with humility, selflessness, generosity, and servanthood? You see, because love without action is not love. Paul in verse 10 shares two exhortations concerning our attitude towards fellow believers, doesn't he? He says what? Be devoted to one another in love. The word translated be devoted, Philostorgus, refers to a special kind of love. It's used only here in the whole New Testament. The term was a common word in wills during that time to denote tender affection within a family. And Paul is simply saying here that you and I should have a tender affection and concern for our fellow believers like we would have for our family members. In more accurate translations, Paul then compounds his thought with the term brotherly love. This phrase is the Greek word Philadelphia. And Paul expects you and I to exercise warm, affectionate family love and brotherly love towards fellow believers. After all, is it not that the Spirit is thicker than blood? On January the 24th, 1989, a mother talked to her son by phone and afterwards told others that were sitting around, he sounds wonderful. He sounds very much at peace with himself. At the conclusion of the call, she told him, son, you'll always be my precious boy. Nothing extraordinary about such a call, except that the mom was Louise Bundy. And she was talking to her son, Ted, just before his execution in Utah. You see, everyone else hated her son, but not Louise. She had a mother's love for him. Do you love others even when they disappoint you? When they hurt you? When they let you down? When they do things you wouldn't do? You see, our love as Christians is to both be a response to God's love and a reflection of His love. Our Lord's love was a far cry from the hypocritical love of the scribes and the Pharisees of its day. Because we know they spoke of good, but in practice they did what was evil. The love of God, men, is simply that which clings to good and abhors, detests that which is evil. In the latter part of verse 10, we're supposed to be humble because Paul issues a friendly competition to treat or honor one another well. He wants you and I as believers to lead the way in showing honor for others. In every sphere of our life, we ought to seek to outdo other believers. Look for ways to honor them before they honor you. Recognize others' accomplishments before they honor yours. Defer to other believers before they defer to you. Captain David Rillings was required to attend a parade in Washington, D.C. It was at the Marine Barracks. Marine Barracks is the oldest post in the United States Marine Corps, the official residence of the commandant of the Marine Corps. Since 1806, it is the main ceremonial grounds of the Corps. It's also home to the U.S. Marines Drum and Bugle Corps. Captain Rillings became lost while driving through Washington, and he spotted Fort McNair as an Army installation. And he pulled in to ask directions. The sentry standing there, and the soldiers seemed friendly, and he gave him precise, down to the point, to mile instructions. And Captain Rillings was impressed with the soldiers' helpfulness towards another member of the armed services until he arrived at the National Zoo. We're to be humble, man. You see, you look for what you can provide in a relationship rather than what you can receive. How many of us do that? You should look at what you can provide instead of what you can receive. Paul goes on in detail in verse 11 with our attitude towards God's work. What does Paul write? He says, "Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor." You've heard perhaps about the guy who asked if he thought ignorance and apathy were the two greatest problems of the human race. And he responded, "I don't know, and I don't care." Well, Paul doesn't want to see that kind of attitude in us as believers. Rather, he urges us to be diligent and fervent in our love and service for others. That word is translated fervent. Zeo means to boil or to seethe. To be fervent in spirit means to allow the Holy Spirit to set us on fire. Too many of us are lukewarm. Too many of us are a pot of cold water. We're not on fire. In verses 12 and 13, Paul offers 5 exhortations dealing with the attitude towards difficult circumstances. In verse 12, he states that we display true love when what? We're joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. Nothing will make you love a person, believe me. I've seen this work towards some of you. Nothing will make you love a person so much as praying for that individual. A simple adage is this: the person who prays the best is the person who loves the best. Are you having struggle, perhaps loving someone, another brother? Then tonight start to pray for him. The Lord can resolve issues if we'll just turn it to Him in prayer. Raymond Edmond was president of Wheaton College years ago. He often told his students, chin up, knees down. That's good advice. Chin up and knees down. Use things, not people. Love people, not things. There's a connection between verses 12 and 13, contributed to the need of the saints, practicing hospitality. You see, times of tribulation, men demand a spirit of generosity and hospitality when others are in need. The word translated contributing, koniai, means to have in common or to share. You're to share your material resources to help meet the needs of others, believers. Some would say, I think that hospitality is making people feel at home when you wish they were there. The word hospitality is more expressive than the English word, for it means a love for strangers. It means that word practicing, deiko, is also not strong enough. The Greek word means pursue or to persecute. Paul wants us to pursue hospitality. Yet many of us view our homes as our castle, reserved exclusively for our own pleasure. But you see, our homes are all leased from Him because He's the one that's made it possible for us to have them. Not your job, not your annuity, because all that is from Him. Your time, your talents is from Him. And so we are simply leasing those homes from Him, and they are to be used as places of support and strength for others. It's often easier, I think you'd agree with me, to meet the material needs of someone by writing a check or giving a possession. God calls us to open up our homes. There's something special, is it not, about being invited into someone's home? I think it's one of the greatest expressions of love and acceptance. It's the reason none of you have been invited into my home. No. Very few of us do this on a regular basis. Many of us would complain that it takes too much work. Isn't it true? Kick the toys into a corner. Kick your stuff into a corner. Invite people over. Get to know them. Many of us don't even know our neighbors. It's not the way it used to be for us old folks. We knew who lived down the street and around the corner and around the bend. Now you don't even know who lives next door on the other side of the tree. In verses 14 through 16, Paul returns our attitude towards fellow believers. He writes, "Bless those who persecute you, and bless and do not curse." I believe that commandment relates primarily to persecution you might receive from other believers. Taking shots at somebody who may be your friend, who may be your co-worker, who may be in your church, who may sit next to you in the pew. Those are the toughest kind of shots to take, aren't they? The Greek word for bless literally means to speak well of a person. Our English word eulogize is taken from that Greek word. Here, to bless your persecutors is to eulogize them, to speak well of them. But you know what it takes? It takes self-control and grace. Paul states, "Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep." An old Swedish proverb says this, "Shared joy is a double joy. Shared sorrow is half a sorrow." The Swedes had it right. Paul wants you and I to show fellow believers sympathy and understanding. Which is more difficult? Rejoicing with those who are happy, with those who rejoice, or sympathizing with those who are hurting? We need to look for opportunities to love others. Paul concludes that with a power-packed verse, 12:16. He writes, "Be of the same mind towards one another. Do not be haughty in mind, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation," the more accurate translation says. But Paul is calling all of us to have a common mindset. He's not suggesting that you and I all think in the same way, Paul, about every issue. Except that we are to agree to disagree agreeably over non-essentials. And in doing so, we'll demonstrate the love and the unity of Christ. Paul commands us not to be haughty in mind, rather to associate with the lowly. The word lowly is translated, refers to those first century Christians who could boast of little in the way of worldly goods or possessions or positions. The command, "Do not be wise in your own estimation," implies that we need to recognize that often the socially lower Christians have much more to give than the rich. All Christians, all of us, have something to share with others. And all of us, no matter how old or how young, have things to learn from other Christians. The problem is that we often think like Archie Bunker, who said, "I'm not prejudiced, I love all those inferior people." We need to simply get over ourselves. That's the biggest hurdle. We need to get over ourselves. We need to see our fellow believers accurately and biblically. We need to exercise humility, because if we're humble, we'll never look down on anyone again. We can only look up to them. We need to begin to think of others as more important than ourselves. Love without action is not love. You see, sacrificial love does not focus on us or demand anything in return for what it does for another. It simply puts others first. Sacrificial love. Where do you and who do you need to extend that to tonight? Paul kicks it up another notch and tells us in Division 2, 17 through 21, display supernatural love. A young man left Woodway and moved to New York, and after about a week he had his own apartment. In a few weeks his parents phoned to find out how he was doing, and they said, "What are your neighbors like?" That's one of those mom questions. "They're a bit strange," the young man said. "On one side there's a man who keeps banging his head against the wall, and on the other side there's a woman who just cries all the time and moans." She said, "I'd keep to myself, son, if I were you." "Oh, I do," said the young man. "I just stay in my room all day and play my bagpipes." Well, that'd be supernatural love to me. That concept's not hard, man. It's flat out impossible. I believe. But that's good because supernatural behavior forces us to go back to Christ on a moment-by-moment basis. Paul has one theme in this section, I believe: don't fight fire with fire. In verse 17, he says, do not repay evil for evil. And I think that's a general summary statement for the next 5 verses. Paul uses the word never. Medin. What is it?
Maiden.
That's exactly correct in your pronunciation. Maiden. That provides us, men, with no loopholes. None of that stuff where you don't know what he did to me. You don't know what he did to my family. It provides us no loopholes. Never pay back evil to anyone. Instead, the apostle exhorts us to respect what is right in the sight of all men. The word respect, translated literally, means to take thought beforehand. You see, if you and I were to respond biblically to our enemies, we must thoughtfully prepare before a crisis arrives. In other words, carefully and deliberately think about how you would respond if someone does something to you or to one of your family members. Because if we don't prepare ahead of time, we're going to respond in a fleshly way from our flesh. And it's not going to be the way of Christ. Paul goes a step further when he says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Remember, look at the conditional nature of the verse. It says, if possible. You can't force others to do what is right. Once we have done everything in our power to resolve a conflict, we fulfilled our responsibility. Now, if the circumstances change and there seems to be a new opportunity for peace with our enemies, then we should pursue it. But in the meantime, we shouldn't waste our time or energy or effort. We shouldn't blame ourselves. Sometimes people are just not going to change. We've got to trust God to change those individuals. Only He can prepare and soften hearts. He writes, never take revenge, my dear friend, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. John F. Kennedy says, don't get mad, get even. Paul slams the door shut for revenge. Rather, he states, we must leave room for the wrath of God. The verb translated to leave room literally means to give place. In other words, get out of the way. Get out of the way and leave room for something else. See, Paul simply wants us to give God His job back. By you and I refusing to take revenge, we are leaving room for God to exercise His wrath. The wrath of God is likely both temporal and eternal in this context. Paul literally quotes Deuteronomy 32 to serve as a reminder that no one can quite avenge like God can. If you want Him to avenge you, step out of the way. If you want to avenge yourself, God's going to remove His hand from that situation. I don't know about you, but I'd rather have God avenge. Paul wraps up the chapter with a series of commands. In verse 20 he writes, but if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing so, you'll heap burning coals on his head. Those verses are a quote from Proverbs 25, which shows that Paul understood the classic military principle that the best defense is an effective offense. He doesn't encourage a passive response to evil. He commands us to go on the offense. Not to beat down or destroy those who are our opponents, but to lavish what? Our enemy with love. Abraham Lincoln once said this, the best way to destroy your enemy is to make him your friend. Augustine said, if you are suffering from a bad man's injustice, forgive him, lest there be two bad men. Does that mean we're called to be a doormat as Christians? No. We're called to be an elevator. We're to lift people up into the presence of God by graciously giving our enemy food and drink in the time of need. And Paul goes on to say you'll heap burning coals on his head. That phrase is often used as a motivation for the kindness shown to an enemy. So I think it's important for us to take just a moment to understand that statement. If you've got an enemy and you really want to see him burn, be extra nice to him. If you really want to see him seethe, be nice to him. They won't be able to stand it. Now that's hardly in the spirit of this passage. A better interpretation, I think, is to take the burning coals as a figure of God's judgment that will come on our enemies if they persist in antagonism. The figure of coals of fire in the Old Testament constantly refers to God's anger and judgment. Paul concludes with a summary: do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. It's very straightforward. So I think it's easy to interpret. However, in our flesh, this is not a verse that you and I would obey. We would rather overcome evil with evil, wouldn't we? To return evil for evil is our nature. I think to return good for evil is supernatural. But you see, that's how God's economy operates. Evil cannot overcome the Christian by doing us harm or even by killing us. Evil will only overcome us if it makes us evil ourselves. How do you want to be remembered? I started that off tonight. How do you want to be remembered? My hope is that you want to be remembered as a believer who loved others, especially other believers. When you stand before Christ, I believe one of the first questions He may ask is, did you love my children? And why do I say that? John 13. Jesus' words are this: all people will know that we are His disciples if we have love for one another. Love was very important to Christ. It compelled Him to give up His life for each of us in this room. And He wants us to imitate that love in how we deal with others. And often that has to be through a supernatural working in our lives, because that's not our nature. I personally don't think there is anything in this world harder than living with other people. They never do what you want them to do. But since I can't control them, I'm left with nothing to do but what? To control myself. We need to be honest about our lives tonight, men. If there are matters in your life that need to be addressed, we need to go to the Father in prayer, and He'll straighten them out. If you have a problem with someone, if you're not showing them the love that God calls and Paul talks about here, ask Him to help you. You see, evil cannot be overcome with more evil. It can only be disarmed by what is good. The Lord is the only one who can make things right when things go wrong. And I simply ask you to identify those relationships tonight where you need to grow in love. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.